Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. Good morning, Jeff. Have you got your credit card ready?
I've got my credit card ready, and it's hot. It wants to be used, but I'm trying very, very, very hard to be calm, be rational. You know, all the things that happen after a big Apple announcement. Like, yes, give me all the things. And then I have to stop and think, now, wait a minute, do I really need this? Is this something that's going to help me? That whole process that happens several times a year.
Well, you don't really need an iPhone SE, do you?
No, I don't. You're right. Okay, good. Mark that off the list. I do not need an iPhone SE.
iPad Air?
iPad Air, nope. Because so this is what happened to me last year. Last year, I started off saying, I don't need any of these things. I'm pretty good. I've got an old iPad Pro. I've got a 2019 MacBook Pro. I'm set. I am beyond temptation. Yeah, you can totally see where this is going. And then they announced the iPad Pro with an M1 chip. And because I've written extensively, I've written books about using the iPad for photography, and this could open up all sorts of things. So I decided to go for it. So I bought that. And then the new MacBook Pros came out, and I said to myself, I've been able to pretty much have maybe 3, sometimes 4, 5 years of life when I have a MacBook Pro, and that's been great. So it would be insane of me to get a new machine after only 2 years. Like, only crazy people do that. Yeah. And I say that as I'm looking here at my 2021 MacBook Pro. And honestly, it was a stretch financially on my credit card, my Apple card, hooray, cashback, et cetera, et cetera. But this is such a good machine. I do not regret it. So I'm set, right?
You and I have different philosophies. For a long time, I would keep my Macs for about a year and a half or 2 years because that would be the sweet spot at which you'd get a good resale price. And since, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, they were evolving so quickly. You wanted to get the new technology, and now we've passed that. When I bought my 24-inch iMac last June when it came out, I had my previous iMac more than 3.5 years, and that was the longest I'd had a Mac since I've been working, around this. And I even sold it on eBay for about half what I paid for it. So if I look at this from an accounting point of view, that's a profit coming in after the depreciation. That means that it cost me, I'm going to say, £1,200 for 3.5 years, which is next to nothing when you think about it. So if you keep them in good shape, Macs do retain value.
Yes.
If you can turn them over at the right time, to the right people, you can get good money. And I think one of the main reasons I got the most for that is when I got it, I spec'd it out as much as I could. I mean, I didn't, back then you couldn't get 64 gigs of RAM, but I did get the maximum. I got a better video card, more storage, and extra RAM.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And actually, here's, I think, one of the key differences, and maybe this is a regional thing, but you seem to have no problems at all selling equipment. Yeah. And yet when I consider doing it, maybe this is just because this is the way in the United States, like everything seems like a scam. Trying to do eBay or Craigslist or some of these, I have lots of hesitation because there's just so many people out there who are like, yeah, I totally will buy this for your price. Can you drive this to Portland for me? You're like, no. This happens with camera equipment too. And in fact, I'll point listeners to, we had an early episode about buying and selling camera equipment. And so another option would be to take it to some of these services like Gazelle, and they'll give you money for it, but they don't give you very much money at all.
I disagree. I've sold a number of things to MPB that has both a UK arm and a US arm.
For camera stuff.
I would say they give you about 10%, 15% less than what you can get, but that's fine for me compared to selling on eBay.
Oh, okay.
They've always been really great. They pay quickly, never a hassle.
Yeah.
So hats off to MPB.
Okay, yeah. Well,
that's camera stuff, obviously.
That's camera stuff,
not
yeah.
computers.
Yeah. So what I found is, so I'm in this weird position because part of my justification for buying this new MacBook Pro was that Apple would give me $1,600 for my 2019 MacBook Pro. And so I just did the trade-in, which is
that's a really good trade-in because they usually don't give you that much. I think they really wanted to push these new M1 Macs, so they were giving better trade-ins.
Yeah. And my 2019 has a 2 terabyte SSD, so it again, like you said, it's pretty well spec'd out, and that was fine. The problem was at some point, and I don't remember this happening, I must have bumped the edge of this or something because they rejected my trade-in. One corner is like slightly barely bent, and to the point where I did it's never affected it. And so shortly after I had sent it off, I got a thing from the company saying your amount has changed. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe it's scratched or something. Your amount is currently 0. And with some back and forth with Apple, I saw that basically it's the back left corner that's just slightly bent.
But near the hinge.
But kind of near the hinge. It's never affected anything, but they're like, nope, we can't take it. So they sent it back to me.
Yeah.
And for my troubles, then just charged me the balance of what the trade-in was, of course, for my new computer. So now I need to sell this. And so I went to look up other sites where I could do the trade-in. And for this machine, it's got 32 gigs of RAM. It's, like a good, highly spec'd machine. They're like, well, we'll give you $800 for it. And that's not what I was hoping, So now I'm in that position of, okay, well, it's a great machine. I want to sell it. Do I go through all of that hassle? So,
well, when I've sold on eBay, and I've sold computers, I've sold audio equipment, camera equipment, I always make sure the buyers have lots of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you can scam that. There are ways to scam it, but I've never had a problem. And, eBay guarantees things. And I once sold a camera to someone. It was an Olympus camera, this is going back 7 or 8 years, and the person complained that it rattled. So they filed a dispute or whatever it is. And I said, dude, this is the optical image stabilization. It rattles.
Yeah.
And this is just the way it works on Olympus cameras. So obviously eBay, I explained, and eBay sided with me. It was the only time I ever had a problem.
Oh, interesting.
But it could be different in the UK versus the US. Anyway, we were planning to talk about something totally different today. And before we recorded, we said, well, what about these new Macs? So we figured we'd talk about them. And I want to just quickly give my take that Apple has come out with a big fat Mac Mini, pretty impressive computer. And I think the most impressive thing to me is this tiny little thing. It's got an SD card slot on the front. It's got 2 USB-C ports on the front. It's got 4 USB-C ports and 2 USB-A ports on the back. So it's got lots of connectivity. It's a really ideal desktop machine. The problem is it's expensive. It starts at either $2,000 or $4,000. Mm-hmm. Of course, no display, no keyboard, mouse, right? So you got to add them. We all have keyboards and mouses, right? But the display is $1,500, and it starts with 512 gigs of storage. So you've got to up that. And there's a middle spot that's missing. There's we've got the current iMac, which you can get a well-spec'd for less than $1,500. I think it starts at $1,299, the base model. Mm-hmm. But then if you want the Mac Studio, interesting name, by the way, Mac Studio, plus the display, you're getting north of $3,500 before you add anything on extra storage. And there's a big gap in there. Now that the 27-inch iMac has been discontinued, there's nothing in between the sort of basic M1 Mac and the new Pro versions.
Yeah. This is one of those things where you really need to define an audience for these machines, because obviously we're coming at this from the point of view of, is the Mac Studio a good computer for photographers? Because a lot of the stuff that Apple showed off is related to content creation and imagery and video. And so
18 streams of 8K video simultaneously. I mean, seriously.
that's how I wake up every morning, man. 18 streams.
You can edit a major motion picture on that computer.
Oh, totally.
If you're just an enthusiast photographer, you don't need that.
Well, yes and no. See, the problem is I can think of excellent reasons on both sides of this. All right, let's say if you have an old machine.
Gear acquisition syndrome.
I don't know what you're talking about. This is the ghost of gear acquisition syndrome rearing its head.
Yes.
I guess what's interesting is you have to throw a bunch of hypotheticals at it. If you are someone who has been using an older machine, let's say you have an iMac that's 4 or 5 years old, then
pre-M1.
Pre-M1, probably can't upgrade to the latest OS maybe. Then something like this is appealing because you have a lot of power and you have a lot of, like you were saying earlier, a lot of specs, a lot of future proofing, right? So being able to get one of these machines and have it last for many, many years seems very, very doable.
Yeah, but in 3 years, the new machine's going to be so much better and 60% faster and 3 times brighter and makes your life 6 times better.
It's going to be 10 times more magical, 4 times more incredible to take Apple's marketing.
No, the thing is, first, I think the first division is, are you a professional photographer? If you are, then you should definitely look into this, right? You should definitely consider
Totally.
it. If you're not and you can afford it, well, then that's fine if that's what you want to spend your money on.
Sure, absolutely.
But if you go to the high end with the M1 Ultra chip, you could buy a Leica for that, right? You could buy an expensive lens or a bunch of lenses. So it's a question of, what is more important to your photography? Is it the post-production and you want to have the newest machine because you feel good about it, and that's entirely possible?
Sure.
Or is it the fact that you actually need this because you're a pro, you're going through thousands of photos when you shoot weddings, et cetera? I think, there's use cases like that.
Exactly, yeah. And like those are all the hypotheticals that you have to sort of throw at the question, because there's also a good argument to be made where if you are a enthusiast photographer or a semi-pro photographer, the likelihood that maybe you are going to be creating video is pretty good. And so then you have to start thinking about, well, having all these extra GPU cores and being able to render things quickly out of Final Cut Pro, is that worth it to you? I can say after doing a bunch of videos for a book project, my purchase of this MacBook Pro that has the M1 Max chip in it. It's got more GPUs. Being able to render things out quickly actually made a big difference, and I was really glad that I had it. But again,
But I wonder how much of a difference there is for average users with any M1. We know that every M1 has had the same performance in single core performance. So that's web browsing. That's probably editing a lot of photos, depending on the photo app. Mm-hmm. Most of what you do is single core. The big difference in the different M1 processors is the multi-core. And we don't know yet how much that will make it. If you're editing photos, I use iStat menus, a utility that puts things in my menu bar, including little CPU core things. And I can see when the CPUs are working, and I can see when I edit photos, it barely flexes a muscle on my iMac. So photo editing, I can't see that as a process that requires a lot of power. Well, video obviously is very different, but in video, it's the rendering that requires the power more than anything else.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And rendering while you're working, if you have that turned on, all of the smoother playback and all of that.
Yeah, that might make a difference.
But in terms of processing, I think earlier I mentioned the iPad Pro and the M1 and how the hardware has outpaced the software a little bit. This is something I'm a little concerned about with this Mac Studio because it has such amazing hardware capabilities. And I'm going to take a little sidebar here and just mention how cool it is that in order to make the Ultra, rather than making a brand new chip, the Ultra is just two M1 Max chips that they've combined together. They have a little edge bit that they didn't tell anybody about, or at least that's the way they presented it, where they could combine these two and double the power of it.
Do you know why they had to do that?
No.
Because chip sizes are limited. You can't just keep making bigger chips. It's just chip making process that limits it. And it's what they call the die size. And they were mentioning that a couple of times. So the only way you can increase it is essentially this is parallel processing.
Yeah.
And I've been saying for the past couple of years that their next step is going to have to be parallel processing. One, because of the die size, and two, because the transistors are so small that they are getting very close to the size of an atom. And you can't get any smaller than that. You can't. We'll have quantum computers, and there are quantum computers being developed. But with the kind of computers and processors we have, they are hitting limits.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that the Mac Pro that they teased, which we'll probably see in June at the Worldwide Developers Conference, is going to have 4 of these things connected.
Yeah. Yeah. Or an M2 or 4 M2s or yeah. I mean, I think it's a brilliant solution, and I wonder now, going back to what an average photographer is going to be doing, I wonder how much that affects sort of everyday editing, because you're right.
Not at
all. A lot of the software, I think, now does a better job of taking advantage of multiple processor cores. A lot of it still doesn't use GPUs as effectively as they really could be doing. And so it does make me wonder how much of this awesome processing power you have is actually going to be used. And even more important, are you going to feel it? Is it going to seem like everything you're doing is faster?
Yeah. If you're rendering video, you can time it.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely.
You can see how long it takes. Does it take the time to make a cup of coffee, or does it take the time to make that cup of coffee and drink it? That's the difference. And you'll see the difference.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I just want to mention one thing on Apple's press release. When they're comparing the performance of the Mac Studio, we'll start with the M1 Max, they're comparing the CPU performance to the 27-inch iMac with a 10-core processor. That is an Intel processor. They're comparing it to the Mac Pro with a 16-core Xeon Intel processor. They're comparing the graphics performance to a 27-inch iMac. Now, one of these comparisons is to an M1 Mac.
No, because they're all M1 Macs, and so
right.
Yeah.
So we don't know how much faster. You could go back and compare the other M1 Macs to whatever they compared, but we don't know how much faster they are than M1 Macs. And I think, again, a lot of this is gear lust. A lot of this is, I mean, the connectivity thing is really important, right? For a lot of people.
Sure.
But I think that that 99% of people are never going to touch what this can do. And I come back to, there's a space in the middle between the Mac Mini and something a little bit better. Because we both agree this is a wonderful display at $1,500.
Oh yeah.
I was saying the previous Apple display that was discontinued in 2016 was the Thunderbolt display. It was 30-inch or 27. I don't remember. It was $999. Where 6 years later, it kind of makes sense. $1,500. Plus, it's got 4 ports in the back. One of them can charge a Mac at 96 watts. It's got Thunderbolt, and they pointed out it's got an A13 chip in it. I'm like, dude, who cares? Are you going to be able to run software on the display alone? If that's the case, that'd be interesting. Like, can you convert it to an iPad, a big iPad? But it's a fine display. It's $300 more than the LG 5K display. Probably worth it. So no complaints.
No complaints there.
It's just that the Mac Studio just seems to be. I would have liked to see 3 models: a low end, medium, and a high end, because there's a gap between the Mac Mini and the Mac Studio. Now, maybe you were saying before we started, they're going to upgrade the Mac Mini with a better processor. Perhaps.
Yeah. I could totally see them sort of as a mid, like maybe pre-WWDC announcement that, hey, as an option, you can put an M1 Pro in the Mac Mini if you want that. And so then you have like maybe a $1,800 base model machine. This is also the Apple thing, right? Where you think to yourself, I don't need a Studio Mac because it's $2,000, and that $2,000, of course, is the base, and all of us are probably going to increase the storage, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just say it's $2,000, and you think that's too much for what I need right now. So I'm going to look at the iMac. Well, I don't really need the iMac because I really want a bigger screen. Okay, so now set that aside. So I'm going to do the Mac Mini because it still has an M1, and I can connect it to the new display or a display that I already have, and that starts at a much more reasonable price. So now let's say I want to add $400 or $800 for an M1 Pro machine. So now I'm in the sort of like $1,600 range. Well, that's really not that far from the $2,000 of the Studio. And
yeah, but the 2,000 isn't really 2,000. You've got to add stuff to it.
It's true.
Think of 2,500. But I know that's the logic. It's
that
all these
purchasing
steps.
logic. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One thing I want to go back to is the thinking behind what you need as a photographer and where you would see these kind of gains. Because, like we said, in sort of every day, I'm sorting through photos, I'm rating them, I'm editing them. You're not going to see a whole lot of difference.
Any M1 Mac will be fine.
That's it, exactly. Because some areas where you will definitely see a difference are when you're assembling panoramas or doing HDR merges, things that are more computationally intensive. I know that if you have an older Mac and like a newer Sony camera that makes, I don't know what they're at, 50 megabyte images, and you're trying to, put together a panorama of that, that's definitely the thing where you make your coffee, you drink it, you read the newspaper, you come back and see if it's done. And so just if you're doing a lot of that kind of work, then moving up. But I keep coming back to something that you said, because when you bought your M1 iMac, which I think is the machine you're using now, right?
Yeah.
You were theorizing that you probably wouldn't really need to buy another computer for many years because it does.
I'm thinking 5 years on this one. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the Studio is super, super cool. But for a lot of people who just want to do photography, just the base M1 is still really good. It's only when you're thinking about, am I going to be rendering video? Am I going to be doing some of these things where a GPU would make a difference? Then you'll start thinking about that. Or, and I think this is the real story that Apple is pushing, and I think where most of these are going to be sold. If you are a graphic designer in a design shop or a production shop, publishing shop, I think they're going to buy a ton of these Mac Studios because they can replace a lot of old machines and get really like super performance, especially if maybe they had Mac Pros or they're doing 3D renders that will really, really, really benefit from this hardware. That's a no-brainer. And I fully expect that's where most of these machines are going to go.
Yeah, and as of today, the Mac Pro is obsolete.
Yeah.
These new computers blow away the Mac Pro, which they're still selling, but they upped the base storage on the Mac Pro to 512 gigs, which is, really generous.
Oh, well, never mind then. I'm going to trade in this.
The Mac Pro starts at $6,000.
Yeah.
And once you start adding stuff, because we're talking about, actually, I think you can put your own RAM in the Mac Pro because it's an Intel Mac. It's probably the last one. So you could save money there. But if you want things like storage and all, you do have the ability to put cards in. And that's the big thing about the Mac Pro. You can do some upgrades that you can't do with any other Mac.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to keep that going forward to the next Mac Pro. But as you said, it's the design places, the video editors, the 3D. There was a woman from Ableton Live talking about hundreds of tracks and music, and that's where you need it.
Yeah.
But it's like all the people sitting there on their couch at home watching this thing do not need this computer.
They don't. It's super compelling. I mean, I love the fact.
I like the technology, but
I like that it exists. I like what they're doing.
Exactly.
I also like that Apple is not just cruising and saying, hey, the M1 is perfectly great and here's something that looks a little bit different. That they're really sort of pushing ahead and clearly pushing on this transition to M1, but also not just sitting on their hands, which sometimes they've tended to do in the past. But again, I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited for other people to get this.
Do you know what this looks like?
What does it look like?
The Mac Studio. It looks like the Mac Mini server, which existed for a couple of years back in the day. It was like twice the height of the Mac Mini because it allowed you to put a second hard disk into it.
I had totally forgotten about that. See,
Yep.
I was thinking this is just Apple's ongoing efforts to revive the Mac Cube, and
No, not quite.
not quite.
If they added about half the height or a little bit more, it would be a cube.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see that going forward. Another thing, this is the first new Mac name since 2008.
Oh, right. Yes.
The last new Mac product was the MacBook Air in 2008. Since then, it's all been iterations of the same name.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a big step for Apple to actually have a new name.
Yeah.
But obviously, the term studio is to indicate that, well, people working in studios need this, right?
Yeah.
They're not calling it pro. And that's interesting because they don't want it. Pro sounds too technical, like you're an engineer, right? Rather than someone creating. And that's what they want to do. And like you, I think it's good that it exists. I think, it's overkill for all of us. If anyone listening to the show actually plans to buy one, please let us know. Drop us a line. What's our email address? I even forgot.
I do not know.
Do we even use email? Well, we've got a Facebook group. I don't think we have an email address set up with the podcast.
Well, you can go to photoactive.co and there's a contact form. And so that will send us an email. So use that form. That's the best way.
Because I'm curious if anyone does buy this or is planning to buy one. I'd like to know the reasons why. I mean, if you're a professional photographer, that's obvious. If you've got lots of money, that's obvious too. And if you got lots of money, you can buy one for Jeff too because he really wants one. I can tell.
Actually,
me, I don't care that much. And when I bought the 24-inch iMac, actually, I upgraded from a 21. I had downgraded before from a 27. And because I don't want that big screen, I don't really need it. I don't want my entire field of vision swallowed up by a big screen. So for me, the 24 is a nice sweet spot in between. The 21 was a bit too small. So I mean, I like this iMac. It's quiet. It's just, it does what it does. It's there. And, I don't do anything where I need speed. I do screencasts sometime. I use an app called ScreenFlow and I render videos, and it takes a couple minutes to render a 3-4 minute video, and big deal. It's, it's not that serious. So it's just not the kind of thing that people like us need. But going forward, I think the technology, I think the idea of having more connectivity is really good. And here's another alternative. If someone wants a new display and they've got a MacBook Pro or MacBook Air, just connect it to that.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to sort of wrap this up by saying that if you are a photographer and you have any sort of modern Mac, even if you have an old machine and you're thinking, I want more, but I don't really need to go crazy with the studio, getting a Mac Mini even would be perfectly fine for your uses. But I think photographers would really benefit from the display. Because of Apple's color fidelity. It's a wide gamut, P3 wide color wide space, lots of connections, and just, Apple's engineering, and that has always been really good. The screen on this MacBook Pro is amazing. Yeah. And so it's sort of like the camera lens thing. If you spend money on a good lens, you're going to get really good results. And if you have a perfectly acceptable Mac that will do what you need and you get a good display, I think you're probably going to enjoy that, and that'll be just as worth the money that you put into it as, say, I'm going to spend $3,000 on a studio, right?
Yeah. Just one last point about price. Every time there's a new Mac model, you always see a number of websites that go to Apple's configuration page and pick the maximum of everything, and they say what it costs. And I believe when the Mac Pro came out, that you could configure it at like $50,000.
Yeah.
The highest configuration for the Mac Studio is only $8,000.
Yeah. And
I think that says a lot.
Yeah.
That's with 8 terabytes, 128 gigs of RAM, the fastest processor. So when you look at it that way, maybe they've just killed the market for the Mac Pro.
You know, I saw a few like high-end scientists on Twitter during the event talk about how this machine is obsoleting their $20,000-$30,000 machines that are doing super complex calculations. It's really amazing. And I think the only reason why you would want to buy a Mac Pro now is because you need that internal modularity, because you have specific cards or some reason that it needs to be an Intel processor because of maybe some software that you're running, that sort of thing. But it's pretty amazing.
Okay, time for our snapshots. What do you got?
I've got some software. Part of these announcements with the new Studio Display is it's got a better webcam, and so finally you can have decent webcams. And actually, the camera in the new MacBook Pro is also decent, but there's still areas where it's lacking. What I have found is when I'm doing something where I need to be recorded on a video call, I use the software called Camo by a company called Reincubate. Now, last year I've written a few articles for them, so full disclosure, they paid me to write these articles. But it's great software that lets you use an iPhone as your webcam, and I have found it to be really, really good. And I'll put some links in the show notes to the articles that I wrote. But even using an older, let's say an iPhone 7, you still get really good quality because Apple has invested so much in the camera systems. And so Camo lets you connect your phone to your computer as long as you have something to mount the phone on. I have just like an old tripod and an old iPhone mount that I plug my camera into. Then that gives you a really good webcam that means that it's better than what you're going to have internal, and you don't have to go through all the extended stuff involved in taking, say, a mirrorless camera or a DSLR and setting that up. Like, those are all still possible, but the complication level goes way up. So Camo, you can use it for free, and I think it has some branding or something. It has a watermark. You can pay for an annual subscription of $40, monthly subscription of $5, lifetime license is $80. And if you find yourself using webcams a lot, and of course this came out during the pandemic when suddenly everybody was at home, it's totally going to be worth it. Kirk, what do you have this week?
We've had DP Reviews, Chris Nichols and Jordan Drake on the podcast separately, not together, and they had a new video today, which I found really interesting. Sigma, the lens company, has come out with 3 Fujifilm X-mount lenses that work with autofocus.
Oh.
Now, there have been a couple of brands that have done autofocus, but not a lot, and this is a big deal. Third-party lenses that don't do autofocus, well, they're good if you like manual, but autofocus is important. I don't really need these lenses. There's a 16 millimeter 1.4, a 30 millimeter 1.4, and a 56 millimeter 1.4. And the prices are really interesting. They go for, let's see, $459 for the 16, $339 for the 30 millimeter, and $479 for the 56 millimeter. This is around half of Fuji's prices for their equivalents. So I think this is really interesting. However, there's a problem. There's no aperture ring on these lenses.
How do you change the aperture? Is it even possible?
Well, it is. You have to use one of the control dials on your camera.
I don't understand.
That's set to aperture. Yeah.
I don't understand how that works.
Well, the previous 27 millimeter 2.8 Fuji lens worked like that, and they came out with a second model which does have an aperture ring, and I just can't use the lens without an aperture ring.
I've gotten so used to it, right?
Yeah. So I think, like me, you shoot an aperture priority, where the only thing I change is the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. They're calculated by the camera. So I can't not have that ring on the lens. Now, if you don't need the aperture ring, these are really interesting lenses. Chris Nichols in his review was pointing out that they're pretty close to the Fujifilm lenses in terms of sharpness and quality, and Sigma makes very good lenses. So it's worth considering. But I just can't use the lens without an aperture ring. So in any case, some people might be interested. Apparently, these are the same lenses that they've made for Sony and Canon. I think they have the exact same lens. They call them contemporary lenses. They've got for several different lens mounts. So if you do need a new lens and you don't want to spend the Fuji price and you don't care about the aperture ring, go check out Sigma.
Nice.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.